Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, what can businesses and leaders do to support people with disabilities? We speak with two experts on actionable solutions and why job placement matters, plus the importance of addressing invisible disabilities when discussing workforce diversity. All that next. Hi, I'm Nina Melendez. Welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's March 22nd, and let's take a look at the top stories trending today on the platform. Anti-Asian attacks spark outcry. $25 billion rail merger will link U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And the world celebrates Down Syndrome Day last Sunday. Let's take a deeper dive into that story. Families, friends, and advocates marked World Down Syndrome Day with a renewed push for workplace inclusion. The Hiring Chain, a campaign in partnership with LinkedIn, includes a website where employers can connect with groups that help people with Down syndrome find jobs. And joining us for more is Candy Picard. She is the president and CEO of the National Down Syndrome Society. Candy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Candy, I want to start with you. You have been in this position only since 2019. And tell us a little bit about what you've learned here as the president and CEO of NDSS.
Absolutely. So it's been fascinating. I've been with NDSS almost 6 years, but in my role for the last 2, as you've mentioned, I have a 9-year-old son with Down syndrome, and he is really what drives me every day to lead this organization. And I think for us, as an organization, we look at the lifespan of somebody with Down syndrome from birth all the way to end of life, and employment is a huge piece of that. For me personally, I want to look at the future for my son Mason and what opportunities are going to be available for him.
That brings me to my next question. What would you like the professional community to understand about people with Down syndrome?
It's no different than you or I. I think that is really, there's always a saying, and Martina knows this, we're more alike than different. And I think that's key. I think that people with Down syndrome have the same abilities as anybody else. I think there are accommodations that need to be considered, and there are other factors that go into that, but they can do any job that you or I could do.
And speaking of Martina, I want to welcome her to the show. Martina Fuga, who is the Vice President of Core Down. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Core Down was the organization that organized, or launched the campaign that I was mentioning earlier, the Hiring Chain. I actually want to play a clip of this for our audience so they can see a little bit about what we're talking about.
The baker had Simone, and everybody saw that she could do the job. The lawyer went to the baker and saw Simone at work. The lawyer hired John because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The dentist went to the lawyer and saw John at work. The dentist had Sophia because the lawyer hired John because the baker had...
I love that tune. I'm kind of dancing in the background here. It's so catchy. That's actually Sting singing. Martina, tell me about this campaign. What was Core Down hoping to achieve with it, and do you feel like you achieved it?
Oh, this year's campaign developed in partnership with the creative agency Small, starting from the insight that by hiring someone with Down syndrome, employers can actually start a virtuous chain. The more that people with Down syndrome are seen in a work environment, the more they'll be recognized as valuable employees, and the more they'll be hired. So last year, when we showed the campaign, it was March, and a week later, Italy went into lockdown, and everybody's attention around the world was focused on the pandemic. So we decided to put the campaign on a drawer and wait for the World Down Syndrome Day 2021 this year. So in this year, we had the opportunity to work on 2 plus points for this campaign. One is the Sting voice that give to us more possibility to reach people. And the other was the partnership with LinkedIn that helped us to share to the right public this campaign. What we hope to achieve is to connect employers who are interested in hiring people with Down syndrome to organizations around the world that could help to support with the process of hiring.
And what has the response been? Do you feel like it was successful?
Oh, the response was incredible, because we have an impressive response across all social media, but particularly on LinkedIn. And that's what we wanted. According to our estimate, 4 million people have seen the campaign, 1.5 million just on LinkedIn. But what's more important is that we have already received many job offers through the website hiringchin.org.
I love to hear that. That makes me so happy. I want to take a moment and say hi to some of the people who are joining us live on the stream. We've got Monica from Arizona, Alicia from South Dakota, and Jessica from California. If anyone has questions for Candy or for Martina, feel free to write it in the stream and we'll get those answered for you. Martina, you're in Italy. Candy, you're based here in the United States. What are some of the challenges in your respective regions in hiring and finding employment for people with Down syndrome?
I think that the people with Down syndrome has to face misconception. Each person with Down syndrome is unique and has specific interests and skills. People with Down syndrome can do the most common misconception is that people with Down syndrome can do just a simple job, just specific type of job. But we, in our experience, we know that with people with Down syndrome can carry out a number of different tasks, including jobs that require complex thinking and do things that require some initiative. So some people work in restaurant, other in childcare, other in admin, hospitality. Some people, so they can do a lot of jobs.
No,
Candy, what about you? Yeah,
I would agree. I think there is a stigma in society about the potential of people with Down syndrome, but I think there's also limited access to inclusive education and post-secondary opportunities to develop these technical and marketable skills for our community. And then in the US, we do have concerns around income limitations and how that, can impact their health benefits.
So that's an excellent point. I want to discuss the minimum wage for folks with disabilities. What is it here in the United States?
So the minimum wage in the US is $7.25 an hour. And hundreds, but there is this kind of little caveat to it, because there is hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities that are paid less than the federal minimum wage. A study conducted by the GAO found that over half of people working in a sub-minimum wage role were paid less than $2.50 an hour. And that's something that we as an organization are really working on, how we can phase that out and promote wage equity for all people with disabilities.
That's an excellent point. And to my shame, I did not know this until I was starting to do research for this episode. Is this widespread knowledge that folks with disabilities get paid so little?
I think unless you're somehow connected to the disability community, it's not wide known. I mean, there's large organizations that make millions of dollars a year by paying folks less than minimum wage. And to know, it's something that was just normalized for so many years. And I think that, folks are living so much longer with Down syndrome and other disabilities now. To speak of the Down syndrome community, the life expectancy in the 80s was around 25 years old. Now folks are living into their 60s and their 70s and even older. And so I think that shifts the importance of employment and how we're paying our folks, and they're saving money and they're living these independent lives on their own.
Martina, what about in Italy or the rest of Europe? Are you aware?
Oh, yes. In Italy, we have a time limit, working time limit, 24 hours a week. This is the only limit we have, and it's not the salary, the limit. The majority of people that works do not have a standard employment contract. And in over 70% cases, these people receives no compensation or receives less than the normal salaries of the work they do. So that's a point we have to face off.
Are there any cultural shifts that have happened over the years in regards to employing folks with Down syndrome that you have noticed?
I think there is some cultural shifts. I think there's organizations that are thinking outside the box and incorporating people with Down syndrome and other disabilities into their workplace. I think that there is more conversations around supports and accommodations and how they can make that work, in the workplace. It's, accommodations are not something that could be expensive to an organization or be difficult. I mean, accommodation could be just as easy as a different chair for somebody, or having supports to, maybe speak an email versus typing an email. Those are things that are easily accessible within organizations to implement.
I actually want to go to this stream. We've got a ton of questions, which is always awesome. Rosa asks, any tips on how hiring managers should approach job interviews with people with Down syndrome? For Martina and for Candy, feel free to weigh in.
Oh, I think that the most important things is to understand what the person with disability you are interviewing want to do, and then understand which is their right job that could fit with their abilities and their needs too. So I think that the important things is to understand know the person that you are interviewing.
I agree.
What about you? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think also to understand that the interview process could be different. I think that sometimes, we do a lot with HR managers on just kind of understanding, this interview is no different than if you were interviewing any of us on this panel today. I think, but just to be patient and understanding that you may not have that eye contact that you would have with you or I, or it may take a little bit longer to answer a question. So I think when it comes to the interview process, is just the questions are the same, maybe modify them to fit that role, a little differently.
And before I let you two go, we have one last question from Bryant, who asks, how do you go about recruiting individuals with disabilities? Candy, how about you answer that one?
I think it's great. I think that you're seeing a lot of focus on this. As we have about 33% of our staff at NDSS has Down syndrome. And I think you go about it. I mean, you have to kind of probably work within the community. I mean, the job posting is going to be the same, but coordinate yourself with a local Down syndrome association or another disability organization that can kind of put you in touch with who you need to contact within your community to see what the marketplace looks like for this talented group of people.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining me today. It was great to be able to pick your brains on this. Candy Picard, President and CEO of the National Down Syndrome Society here in the U.S., and Martina Fugo, the Vice President of Core Down. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, not all disabilities are as apparent as Down syndrome. In fact, many of them are considered invisible disabilities. And people living with those disabilities, such as depression or chronic illnesses, face different challenges in the workplace. And these conditions are oftentimes overlooked when creating company policies. Well, here to tell us more is writer, producer, and host of the podcast, That Don't Kill Me, Kendall Sizemore. And Kendall, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to speak with you.
I've been looking forward to speaking with you so much. I've been listening to your podcast. It's incredibly insightful and clever. I want to tell our viewers just a little bit about the description of the podcast.
Sure.
a series of non-inspirational, honest, and casual conversations about health, illness, and disability between two uncourageous young adults who were born sick. Kendall, I'm curious why you started this description by saying non-inspirational. Can you explain that to me?
Of course. So I think a lot of times when people with chronic illnesses are telling their stories or they're sharing their experiences, we're often met with this response that is understandable, but I think can often come across as a little bit patronizing sometimes. Oh, you're such an inspiration. Oh, I can't believe you're so brave for going through what you're going through. And I think for a lot of people within the disability community more broadly, people who are particularly dealing with chronic illnesses, it feels really just like, well, I didn't choose this to be my circumstance. And to say that I'm just an inspiration for handling something that I just have no choice over, it feels, I think it's supposed to come across like as a compliment, but that often isn't what it feels like. It feels, like I said, very patronizing. And I think that there are other words that you can use to talk about people who are going through something challenging, but to kind of just we call it inspiration porn, for lack of a better term, and it often feels like a measure of pity, and I don't think that people in these circumstances want to be pitied. We want to be understood, but not pitied.
I understand that. I don't think many people want to be viewed with pity. Kendall, I just want to correct myself because I mispronounced your name. Siesmeyer. Kendall Siesmeyer.
It's a really hard last name, but okay.
Kendall, what are some common misconceptions about people with chronic illness?
Yeah, so I think common misconceptions, I think mostly, especially in the invisible disability spectrum. So people, whether that's dealing with diabetes or a heart condition, I myself am a 2-time liver transplant recipient. The misconceptions, I think, often are actually that we don't have any challenges that need to be met in a workplace, or that we're sometimes, I think, because we don't talk about it or because we might feel nervous to talk about it, that means it doesn't exist, or that there aren't things that could be made better for people with chronic illnesses. I actually think that that's the biggest misconception, is that if you don't see it, it isn't there. And I think that that's a challenge when it comes to dealing with actual problems that we really do have.
And speaking of talking about it, how do you talk about it in the context of a workplace? I know someone who said that when she discusses her chronic illness, she always feels a little bit like she's oversharing, and there's certainly a fear of stigma. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a totally understandable fear. It's definitely a fear that I've had in my professional experience. I really think that normally in the interview situation, in the hiring process, I personally don't share or talk about my disability or illness, because it doesn't really have anything to do with my talents or abilities and skills. And I think the discrimination does exist. So I'm always a little bit careful to not vocalize necessarily those needs unless those needs would impact my interview experience. I think after that fact of getting hired, there's always this question of, do you have a disability, or have you had a disability? And I do check that box because I do think it's important that we're acknowledged as a group of people in the community. And I think oftentimes people with disabilities are really left out of the conversation more broadly when we talk about other kind of categories of difference. I think it's important to have an honest conversation with your manager or your supervisor about what things could happen or you might run into as a problem. I typically don't like to have those conversations immediately, just because it is a nerve-wracking experience. But I think for the people themselves, like, you have to realize you bring a certain perspective to the table. 40% of Americans have some kind of chronic illness or disability. That's a huge group of people. It's the largest minority group in the country. And I think we are an asset, and we do have perspectives that are different than our peers. And so I really like to take that in when I'm approaching those conversations with my manager, and then really just be honest and ask for what I need.
And I just want to reiterate that number because it is a huge number. 40% of Americans live with a chronic illness, and the vast majority of that are invisible, so one would not know. I want to bring up actually a quote from, or information from the Cornell University's Employment and Disability Institute, that disability discrimination charges filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission between 2005 and 2010 said that the most commonly cited conditions were invisible ones. And that's according to the analysis, again, from Cornell University's Employment and Disability Institute, which brings me to my question that you touched upon about the hiring process. You know, when you do bring up, other than checking the box in the application process, how much information do you share? Should one share? How when should this happen in the conversation? How do you make it so that your employment and what you bring to the table isn't all about this disability that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has to sense what their relationship is with their manager. Like, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to disclosure of illness of any kind, whether that's disclosure in a workplace or in other relationships. So I'll just start off with that. But I think the amount of information that is necessary, I think, is the kind of starting point, right? Like, you do not have to go into all of the details. I think coming from a place of, I don't actually need to explain everything to you. These are my rights. I can ask for these simple accommodations so that I can be the best employee for you as possible. And I think coming, not kind of positioning yourself or thinking in your mind, oh, I really need to defend the reason that I'm still valuable, even though I have this issue or have this thing to deal with. I think that's always a good mindset. And then I think it depends on the manager, right? I mean, I am a person who always is perhaps giving more than, because I feel more comfortable sharing, and I share publicly in my life, so it feels less threatening. But I do think it's a thing to practice, and you can practice with people that are not your manager. And I think that that's like a good thing to start modeling, of like, where are my boundaries and how much I want to share. And at the end of the day, I'm all about, and I think a lot of people with any kind of, marginalization or thing that makes them a little bit more vulnerable than the kind of norm, I think it's all about getting people on your team, really. And I'm always trying to get people on Team Kendall. And I think that that's really the goal. But that doesn't need to come from a defensive stance. Like, you can just share the minimum of what you need, and then if the relationship becomes more comfortable, you can share more as needed.
We're on Team Kendall over here at LinkedIn. So we're a big company. I want to say hi to some people joining us: Victoria from Texas, Stephen from New Jersey, and Ricky from Tennessee. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions at all that you want to ask Kendall, put them in the stream, and we'll get those answered for you. Kendall, I want to discuss the issue of health insurance when it comes to employment, because it's huge, especially the system that we have here in the United States. Can you discuss some of the challenges with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge issue, so not even going to skim the surface of it all. But I will say that, as someone with a chronic illness that has a high degree of uncertainty, I am someone who is always very aware and of the need for health insurance. And I know that I can't accept certain jobs because of the lack of good health insurance, because not all health insurance is equal. And so while we still have this system in the United States where our health insurance is tied to our employment, it really does put some kind of like golden handcuffs on people with chronic illnesses, because they have to have jobs that are with big companies who offer a lot of benefits to their employees. And it's something that I actually do discuss in the negotiations process. I do, before accepting a job, ask to see their health insurance plans. And I'm sure that's kind of a unique request, but I've never been met with any kind of animosity towards it. But I do think that hiring managers should be more prepared to answer those kinds of questions for people, because it is a huge factor, whether or not that my medical condition is going to rob me. And I think that, while we, again, like I said, while we still have employer-based health insurance, it does really determine what kind of jobs that I can take. And I think that also goes for companies. There's this move in certain industries towards permalance positions, or hiring people in a kind of freelancer capacity, not providing them with benefits. And what I would say to that is, beyond the fact that it just doesn't seem super ethical, I think you're limiting the kind of person that can take that job. I myself could not take that job, and I think I'm a pretty good candidate. So you're really cutting yourself off from a big population of people.
I mean, 40%, again, that number,
Right,
40%.
right.
Yeah. I have a question from Caroline. She asks, can you share some advice for managers who have direct reports who come to them to discuss an invisible disability? So for the manager. I
love that question. Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I think it's mostly just about being a good listener and being supportive and asking, how can I support you? Thank you so much for sharing this. And really checking in. I have a manager currently who is exceptional about it. I mean, goes really above and beyond, in the sense that she's caring about how I'm feeling physically, how I'm doing, and using some of those check-ins that I have about performance just regularly to also check in about if I'm dealing with any health issue that is affecting my work, or how can she help make my situation better? And I think that just makes for such a supportive environment, and really will make your employee feel really open and able to bring their whole self to work. And I think the other thing is, everyone manages, people with chronic illnesses are experts in their chronic illness. Like, they really know how to manage their life. They're so used to accommodating constantly, and figuring out what works best for them. And so I think oftentimes they have the solutions inside of them. Like, they already know what could be helpful. And typically they're just too afraid to ask. So whether that's an alternate schedule, or moving some hours, maybe working a couple hours in the weekend, whatever it is, I think asking them, they're experts in their condition, I think is really empowering as well.
I think if you bring up an excellent point about differentiating between a nice to have benefit versus something that is protected under the law for disability rights. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, so obviously we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that legislation is kind of the big, broad legislation, the umbrella legislation that covers all different kinds of disabilities, whether they're visible or invisible. I think a lot of people don't actually understand that they are living with a disability, as it's considered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So chronic illnesses, mental health illness, or mental illness itself, addiction, all of those things, in addition to people who use a wheelchair, are covered under this act. And what it is all about non-discrimination. And the issue that I think is the most challenging is that I think because there are so many people who are not disclosing or not opting into the idea that they have a disability because there is still a stigma attached to that word. It's really hard for employers to even acknowledge or realize that that's an issue or a consideration. And the other thing about the Americans with Disabilities Act, as with any kind of legislation, in order for it to have teeth, people have to litigate. And oftentimes, people with disabilities or chronic illnesses are not in the economic position to litigate such claims. And so, really, it's only a law if there's the law, and then there's the kind of cultural or societal acceptance of the law. And I think, we have laws in the books for protections, but I don't know necessarily if we're really there as far as the societal or cultural acceptance of people with disabilities.
Kendall, I want to bring up a few comments from people who are joining this stream. Ricky says that wage equity is essential. I did not realize that workers were being paid so unfairly. And I think he's referring to the conversation earlier about folks with Down syndrome. And Arun says, thank you for sharing. I hope I can definitely look into this while hiring new colleagues. So we appreciate your comments. Yeah, and Kendall, I have to let you go, but it was great having you on. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Kendall Thiesmeyer. She is the writer, producer, and co-host of the podcast That Don't Kill Me. Tomorrow, my colleague Caroline Fairchild will be chatting with an expert on online career and personality tests. Can these tools help build a stronger workforce, or do they create unintentional bias? Catch that right here tomorrow at noon. I'm Nina Melendez. Thank you so much for joining LinkedIn News Live.